Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
The podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is the Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to the Racket Report. I'm Frank Morano. This is a podcast that seeks to understand and explore some of the issues and some of the fascinating stories that have taken place in the world of organized crime. I'll tell you, of all the journalists that I've met covering different racketeering trials and all the journalists that I've read in the lifetime of reading newspapers, I don't think there's anyone that has as much credibility with mobsters, prosecutors, law enforcement officials, and rank-and-file readers as Tony DeStefano. You've probably been reading him for years in Newsday. He's been covering legal affairs, the criminal justice system, a whole bunch of other issues. I've had the good fortune of covering a number of trials with him. Also happens to be an attorney, as if he wasn't accomplished enough. And he's the author of several books, including one of the ones that we're going to talk about today, Vinny Gorgeous, The Ugly Rise and Fall of a New York mobster. Tony, thanks so much for joining me on the Racket Report.
Well, Frank, I'm happy to be here, and you're too kind for a wonderful send-up. Thank you.
So, Tony, give folks an idea of a little bit of your history. I know you are an attorney, but it seems like you've been a reporter for a long time, not just with Newsday and writing these books, but I know you also were a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Fairchild News Service. How did you make that transition from being an attorney to covering legal issues?
Well, what happened was I was going to night law school, and in the daytime I was doing, I had to work, and I took a job with Fairchild, and we started covering, among other things, the mob on 7th Avenue. And, I stayed reporting in the daytime and going to school at night. And after I ended school, took the bar, I was torn between whether I was going to stay in reporting and journalism or whether I was going to be, try to be a lawyer. And I frankly was having a lot of fun as a writer, as a reporter, and I stayed with it. But the law stuff, helped because it helps you get through the system, the intricacies of everything, and you understand what trials are all about and strategies. It's a good thing to have under your belt when you're dealing in this kind of world of organized crime and the courts. So I stayed with it ever since. And like you said, I took a job with Fairchild. We did the 7th Avenue mob thing, and then I went to the Wall Street Journal. And at about that time, Newsday was starting up a New York City edition, and they hired me about the time of the mob commission case. So I got involved in covering that. And, this is not 1986. I'm dating myself, but there you go. And from 1986 on, it's been, court cases, legal affairs, mob trials, some of which you and I covered together. And, out of it, there have been a number of books. And that's it, in a big nutshell.
Well, the books are terrific. I've read, I think, just about all of them with respect to organized crime. And I want to primarily talk to you about Vinny Gorgeous, Vincent Gorgeous Basciano. But in order to properly understand Vinny Gorgeous and his ascendancy within the Bonanno crime family, and we spent a lot of time talking about the Genovese crime family last week, which has raised a lot of people's interest in what goes on in these different crime families. So if we're going to be talking about the Bonanno crime family, it seems maybe an appropriate place to begin is with your work covering Joe Massino, who was the boss of the Bonanno crime family. But before we discuss Joe Massino, his rise and fall, what is the Bonanno crime family? We're going to use that term a lot in the next half hour or so. What is the Bonanno crime family?
Well, the Bonanno crime family is really the legacy of Joe Bonanno, the old Joe Bananas, who was the one of the big bosses in the 50s and 60s in New York City. Joe retired in a fashion after he mysteriously disappeared for a while, but that is a whole story in itself. But to make a long story short, when Joe Bonanno retired out to Arizona, there were other people who took over the family. There were a whole slew of intermediate bosses, and it went on for years like that because Joe, couldn't take over the family again after he had left and did some bit of treachery with the commission in New York City. So there was a bunch of successor bosses, and among them at some point was Philip Rastelli, who he was the title of the boss, right? But he spent most of his time in and out of jail. He got into a lot of legal troubles for much of his mob career. At that point, though, he had to rely on people like Joe Massino, who was a very powerful captain in the family, to really kind of be his street boss. And after Rastelli was basically neutralized through prosecutions and ill health, and then, of course, dying, Massino took over. And Massino was, elected boss of the family, and he took over probably, I would say, somewhere around somewhere between 1987 to about 1991. And Massino took the family, and he took it at a very interesting time because the Bonanno family was sort of on probation. Why? Because it within the mob, not among law enforcement. Okay,
not
among law enforcement. What happened was that Joe Pistone, the FBI agent who penetrated the family undercover as Donnie Brasco, embarrassed the family and embarrassed the mob. So basically, after Pistone made some cases and got a lot of people indicted, the commission in New York, the mob commission, put the Bonanno family on kind of a secondary status. They wouldn't let him take part in any of the big rackets, like some of the big construction rackets. They could do their own thing, but they kept him sort of aside, out of the way. And that was actually working to the Bonanno crime family's advantage because they didn't get nailed in some of these big cases like the commission case. And the construction cases, which really hurt the other families in the 1980s. So the Bonanno family got reconstituted. And under Massino, they actually grew in strength and got their own rackets going. Basically, they were doing a lot of extortion. They were doing gambling, a lot of loan sharking. And, of course, the odd bits of murder here and there. So that's how the Bonanno family under Massino began to thrive. And they had this period where they weren't looked at very closely by law enforcement. So they were left alone.
Just to go back, and you said a lot of interesting things there, but Joe Bonanno, the namesake, the Bonanno crime family, you alluded to his retiring. Now, one of the things that I think a lot of our listeners might have heard in the movies and maybe even read in press clippings, I've certainly heard prosecutors repeat time and again as they're interviewing cooperating witnesses, is that you really can't retire from the mob, that the only way to retire from the mob is to die or to become a cooperator, a rat, against your mafia cohorts. How was it that a high-profile mobster like Joe Bonanno was able to retire from mob life?
Well, when you say retire, it's not in the sense that we normally think of it. If you retire from the mob, they basically are putting you sort of on the shelf and you really don't have control of much of anything in terms of the mob structure. The old story is that you never leave the mob except in a casket or when you die. And that's kind of, when you think of it, that's kind of a fanciful way of looking at it very romantically in a sense. But, you can leave the mob in real life by just not doing anything and just sort of walking away from it, because you can leave a conspiracy anytime you basically want to at some point. But Bonanno, basically, if you want to say anything, he was on the shelf. He wasn't the boss of anything anymore, except maybe out in Arizona.
And what did he do that caused him to earn the ire of the other mob bosses?
Well, there was talk that he was conspiring against some of the other mob bosses. We're talking now in the 60s, and that created them to go into a defensive mode. And he was, they say he engineered his own kidnapping, which may or may not be true, but as Joe Bonanno told it in his biography, he was kidnapped by one of his cousins from the Buffalo area upstate. And because he got a pass in a sense that he wasn't killed for his schemings. And this is the way it worked. This is a very strange period in the Bonanno crime family, because he disappears. Everybody's trying to figure out what happened to Joe Bananas, and he turns up again. And he walked into federal court sometime in the 1960s. I don't have the exact date, and surrendered. And, the rest is sort of history. There wasn't much of a history, because Joe really went up to Arizona, and he didn't get killed. If he was scheming, the mob didn't kill him. And he was able to live out his years. I think he died sometime around the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And
no, it sounds right. We were talking about Joe Massino. You wrote a terrific book about Joe Massino called King of the Godfathers. Why'd you call him King of the Godfathers? What made him so unique?
Well, I think it's only because he was one of the last bosses standing. That old era. Don't forget, you're talking by the mid to late 80s and early 90s, the mob was under increased scrutiny and pressure from law enforcement. And Messina was really sort of the last of the old timers, apart from Vinny the Chin, Gigante, who was around and who was out of that period of the 70s and the 80s. So that's really why I call him the last Godfather. A lot of people have claimed that.
When you talk about Joe Massino, let's talk about the end of his mafia career, because to me, that's the most interesting. Now, usually we see all these gangsters become cooperating witnesses or rats because the prosecutors and the FBI, they always want a bigger fish. They want the guy above him and the guy above him, and hopefully, eventually, they get to the boss. It's one of the reasons that it's so unusual for a mob boss to become a rat. Now, who do you have to give up? You're the top of the food chain. Joe Massino defied that expectation. He was the first full-fledged boss ever to become a rat. We'd seen acting bosses become cooperating witnesses before, but never a full-fledged mob boss, to the best of my knowledge, at least in the New York area. Why would Joe Massino, the king of the Godfathers, the last of these old-school mob bosses, why would he ever become a rat?
Well, the answer, I think, is very simply this. After Joe got convicted in 2004, July, he had another case kicking around, and it was a death penalty eligible case. And he saw some of the other defendants sort of get parceled out from that case. So Joe was like the one remaining guy in jeopardy of getting the death penalty. So that, I think, impelled him to say, hey, everybody else is bailing out. They want to kill me. That's it. I'm looking out for myself. And that's what it was. Look, it went against everything, every other notion of the Cosa Nostra and loyalty. He was looking out for himself, like a lot of other people were at this point in time. Don't forget, Joe had a lot of people turn on him to make the case against him. So he's saying,
including his own brother-in-law, right?
That's right, his brother-in-law, Sal Vitale. And Joe's got to figure, they want to kill me, the feds. Everybody else is kind of getting a pass here. I'm going to take care of myself and take care of my family. He had a wife and a couple of daughters and grandkids, and he was, I'm sure, thinking about them very, very much.
So he did this, in your view, purely out of physical self-preservation. He didn't want to face the death penalty.
I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. I think that he saw the handwriting was on the wall. There was no notion anymore of loyalty. Joe certainly didn't inspire loyalty, and he didn't have it himself. I think he was self-preservation, and that's what he did. Forget about all the notions of the Cosa Nostra and Omerta and all that. Joe had to protect himself.
One of the things that we saw when he testified, I believe, against Vincent Basciano was he spent some time talking about the case that you just referred to, the Donnie Brasco case, where Joe Pistone, as an undercover FBI agent, did infiltrate the Bonanno crime family. How did that film, which I think a lot of people are familiar with from Johnny Depp and Al Pacino, great film, how did that film jive with reality, at least according to Joe Massino?
Well, I think that in terms of reality, I think it jived close to it. The names I think may have been changed in some of these instances. Massino, as I recall, didn't really deal much with that when he was interacting with Basciano, if I have this right. Because they both got they were both in jail together in downtown Manhattan, and that was when Massino agreed to tape Vinny to help make the case against Vinny. So that's how that went. I don't know if he actually, I could be wrong, but I don't think Joe Massino dealt much with that whole notion of Donnie Brasco. But look, Donnie Brasco was on everybody's mind in that crime family.
Oh, I can imagine. I
for
can
the
imagine.
longest period of time.
And what kind of boss was Joe Massino? Unlike the customized suits, not a hair out of place of people like John Gotti or even folks like Joe Colombo, most of the images that we've seen of Joe Massino are him in a jogging suit, a track suit. What do we know about him as a mob boss and as just a character in general?
Joe Massino, first of all, he had a number of legitimate businesses. He had the sandwich shop. He had the catering business. He was a working guy. He was not a nightlife guy. He didn't, spend time in Manhattan. He had his businesses. He had his legitimate businesses. He, like you said, it wasn't a guy who, wanted to impress the public being a sharp dresser. He was very well attuned to surveillance and law enforcement surveillance. He was very sharp about that. And at some point, he decreed that when you talk about me, because he feared that there were wiretaps all over the place, he said, when you talk about me, we're going to pull the ear. Like the ear. And people would, when they were referring to Joe, they would just tug on their ear when they were referring to him and not mention his name. So that sort of kept him off the tapes. In fact, there weren't very many tapes late in his life about Joe. Joe was caught on a couple of tapes in the Angelo Ruggiero prosecution under the Gambino case back in the early 80s. But Joe was very crafty. And in fact, he found a wire that had been placed in his sandwich shop and club in Maspeth. It was quite by accident, apparently, because a radio picked up certain flushing of a toilet. And they caught it on the radio, and they said, well, how do we getting the noise from the toilet on the radio. And they investigated, and they found the bug. And Joe gave the bug back to the FBI guy when he came by because they knew it had been neutralized. He says, "Here's your bug back." Joe was very conscious of surveillance. He was, I think, very crafty in the sense that he had made, as a member of the mob, the sons of certain of his captains. Now, on the one hand, you may say, that makes sense, right? But Joe seemed to think, and I think this is true, that he would, by having the son involved in the crime family as well as the father, that was like a check against the father
cooperating.
From cooperating.
Sure.
It didn't turn out to be the case, right? We know that, but that was Joe. Joe was very tail conscious. He decreed that the social clubs should stop, shouldn't have the social clubs. Don't go to funerals en masse, and be very careful because he realized that, the feds were getting the upper hand and they were doing it through surveillance, either observations or, wiretaps and bugs.
That is wild. Now, we've heard all these interesting deals that different cooperators have gotten. In some cases, like Mikey Scars de Leonardo, they get to keep all sorts of money that they've earned through criminality as part of their final agreement with the governor. In the case of Sammy Gravano, he was able to essentially get a slap on the wrist for committing 19 murders. Aside from avoiding the death penalty, do we know very much about what Joe Massino got in his deal with the government? Did he get anything special?
Well, he did. I mean, he did this basically for the benefit of his family. Joe forfeited close to $10 million in assets when he was convicted. Cash. He kept the cash in his house. Now, if you have like $7-8 million in your house in cash, I don't think I'd ever leave my house because you'd be afraid of the place burning down or somebody breaking in. And he had Krugerrands and gold bars and whatnot. So Joe gave that up. He didn't walk away, with a big treasure chest. But what he did get was consideration that his wife and family would be able to keep certain properties that were in their name. And this would generate, I guess, income for the family so that they could live and have some sort of existence. So that's what he got. He was represented by Ed McDonald, I think, on the cooperation and the former federal prosecutor, and that was a pretty good deal because Joe, took care of his family, and then eventually Joe got out. He got, I guess, relocated under a new identity, and he worked out. It worked out for Joe,
and that's where he resides now in the witness security program.
Yeah, and I don't know where. I mean, I had somebody approach me once to say that they ran into him somewhere in church, but Joe denied it was him. And, I wouldn't be surprised if Joe was maybe somewhere near the New York City area. But I don't know. I don't know where he is.
Before Massino had flipped, what was the relationship like between Joe Massino, the boss of the Bonanno crime family, and Vinny Gorgeous Basciano, the underboss?
Well, Joe, basically liked Vinny. He met him at that restaurant he had. Joe had a restaurant in Queen called Casablanca, and they met there. And, it was Vinny was a up-and-coming captain in the family. And by all indications, they had a good relationship. And that was it. But I don't think Joe totally trusted Vinny just because of the way he was. He was out of the Bronx, number one. And that was, a different crew. That Vinny was part of up there.
So where did Vinny Gorgeous, first of all, the name Vinny Gorgeous, we should tell people how he derived that nickname. How did he get that nickname? There
are a couple of stories about that. One is that because Vinny had hairdressing salon in the Bronx. It was a Hello Gorgeous, that line off of, I think, the Barbra Streisand movie. And that was one iteration of the name. Another is that, Vinny was a very handsome guy. And he was always well coiffed, good dresser. And, that sort of was a secondary meaning for the term gorgeous. But I think probably it was because of that, the combination of the hair salon and also his general appearance, which was quite spiffy.
Your burger is served, and this is our finest Pepsi Zero Sugar. Its sweet profile perfectly balances the savory notes of your burger.
That is one perfect combination. Burgers deserve Pepsi.
And so Vinny becomes the underboss of the Bonanno family around what year? Do we know?
Yeah, this is around after Joe gets convicted, 2004. Things are really in disarray in the family. And Vinny essentially takes it upon himself to be kind of the street boss. And really basically takes control of the family. He says on Joe's behalf, and he did it in the way that he was trying to say that, Joe, I'm doing this for you. I'm running the family for you through me, which was kind of ballsy when you think about it, because he had no clearance to do this. And Basciano, of course, we know this because there were tapes of this. Vinny wanted to give structure to the family because everybody was all over the place. So he appointed various people as underbosses and captains and whatnot. And Joe, of course, went along with it because Joe was making a tape, and Vinny was sort of implicating himself as the tape was being made. So Vinny really asserted himself while Joe was incapacitated to try to run the family and give it some structure.
So Vinny was from the Bronx. He had this salon, Hello Gorgeous. What was his reputation like as a mobster, as a mafia captain, as an underboss, and then ultimately as an acting boss? It seems like he had a reputation among, his other mafiosi as sort of a legitimate tough guy.
Yeah, he was a legitimate tough guy in that world. He started, though, in this period to rub people the wrong way because he's trying to act as the street boss, and he was having captains stripped down to their underwear before they went to meetings because they were afraid of bugs. Sure. So that was really burning people up. And people were starting to, sort of not – they didn't like that. They thought he was just getting too big for his britches. But he was a legitimate tough guy, and he had a reputation for being a killer. And as we found out in some of the cases, he orchestrated and was involved in killings. So he was a tough guy, Vinny.
Ultimately, Vinny Gorgeous ends up getting arrested, and he ends up in the death penalty case himself. Now, based on what you know of Basciano and with the interviews that you conducted with this book, Vinny Gorgeous, which are clearly pretty comprehensive here, why do you think Basciano chose to go to trial, risk the death penalty, rather than do what Basciano did and simply cooperate so that he could avoid the death penalty?
Well, I don't know who he could have cooperated against except some lower level people. He's not going to cooperate against Basciano because Basciano was above him, was already in the government's pocket at this point. There weren't many other people he could cooperate against. So I don't know if he had that card to play. But I also think that, he could have pled guilty, right, and avoided the notion of the death penalty. But I think Vinny's ego sense of self-importance was so grand that he thought he might be able to beat this case. He really did.
And needless to say, he didn't. And
he did not.
He is currently housed at the Supermax facility in Colorado, right?
He was. They moved him to federal prison in Kentucky. That was the last I had checked. The last I checked, that's where he was. He was out there at Supermax for probably 4 years. And then they moved him to Kentucky.
And that's no joke, Supermax. That's where they keep terrorists.
Terrorists, right. You got it. It's like a tough place. There's no moving parts in the cell. I think it's all concrete form stuff. And he was on, I think, lockdown 23 hours a day. By that, I mean he had an hour a day maybe to do exercise and be in the yard, and then, had to be by himself for the rest of the period. But then I guess in Kentucky, it's a different situation. He's got more freedom. He's more of a regular prisoner. Because Vinny, they figured, they thought and they alleged that Vinny had plotted to kill the federal prosecutor in the case.
Right, and it was not just Andres, the federal prosecutor, but wasn't he also implicated in something with the judge, Nicholas Garifas?
Yeah, there was some talk about that. It's one of the crazy aspects of the case because it was, and this is where it gets really strange. Vinny for some reason, got into the Santeria, the notion of Santeria. And he, as I remember this, and this was like, a fantastic element to the story, he would write the names of he thought by writing the names of the judge, the prosecutor, and any other enemy that he would, and put it in his shoe and stomp a certain way that would somehow create the right spirit to put the spirits against the government. Now, the government, from evidence they got, thought that he had made this list as a hit list. And that was a whole round of litigation about that. Ultimately, they protected Andres, the prosecutor, Greg Andres, and I don't think Garifas got any protection. But for a while, they thought this was a serious threat. But nothing ever happened to anybody. And Vinny's family, and Vinny to this day, I'm sure, will say that this was part of a Santeria thing.
That is wild. I mean, you think of people that are likely to get into Santeria. Vinny Basciano doesn't usually fit the profile of somebody that would, but certainly he always defied stereotype. You spent some time in your book writing about Vinny's involvement in something called the Blue Thunder case. What was the Blue Thunder case?
Blue Thunder case was a very big heroin case, basically involving drug dealing in the Bronx, and it was, as I recall, I think Vinny got lawyer Ben Braffman to represent him in that case, and it was a case where, there were serious allegations of heroin dealing, and Vinny, beat the case. I mean, Ben, I read the cross-examination that Braffman did on some of these witnesses, and it was actually, excellent. I mean, it was like textbook stuff for a law school course.
And Braffman is a brilliant attorney for anybody that hasn't seen him in action.
Yeah, no, I've seen him in action a few times, and there have been all acquittals, in fact. You probably think I'm shilling for him, but I'm not. But it's you give credit where it's due, and it was a large case. I think there was allegations that there was $65 million passed through the ring from about a 6-year period. And Vinny was indicted in it, and he went to trial, and he beat the case. and that was it.
It could have fed into his hubris later on for that death penalty case and his decision to go to trial there.
Oh, I'm sure. I think there was some allegation that Vinny somehow got to the jury, but I don't know. I never saw anything that, in my view, indicated that was true. I just didn't.
Yeah,
you never say never in these cases, right? But I didn't see anything.
Yeah, I had heard no real serious allegation that was the case. Now, one of the things that it seems like was not only a kick in the gut for Vincent Basciano from a legal perspective, but maybe even from an emotional one, was the betrayal of his friend Dominic Cicali. That he has sort of been a mafia Sherpa for Dominic Cicali, very close to Cicali. Cicali ultimately decides to cooperate against Basciano and others. What did that mean for Basciano?
Well, that was devastating and was the ultimate betrayal, because Cicali was involved with Basciano on a number of things, including the homicide in the Bronx, which was part of his case, the shotgun murder of in the Bronx.
Was that Pozzolo?
No, it wasn't Pozzolo.
Santoro? Was it Santoro?
Santoro.
Yeah.
Santoro, yeah. Pozzolo was a different homicide, and that was Cicali, I think, had some involvement in that. And that was, look, you got somebody who's with you on a lot of bad stuff and then decides to turn. That was devastating to him. Cicali was on the stand for maybe a couple of days, and he just said it, told it like he remembered it. He seemed a little, I wouldn't say rehearsed, but he seemed a little sort of maybe I wouldn't say scripted either, but it seemed very matter of fact. In his testimony, like it had been gone over before, which is not unusual, right? You get prepped by prosecutors.
That's true.
Right?
That's
part
true.
of the game.
In terms of, so did you cover two of Basciano's trials, the death penalty case and then the prior case that sent him to prison?
Yeah, there was a prior case, racketeering case, and then there was a case with the death penalty, which was the Santoro issue, and that there were both trials. He beat one of the counts in the first trial, and then in the second trial, I remember when he got convicted. I remember his face, got flush red. It's like he didn't believe it, and he didn't believe it. He honestly, or probably didn't believe it in his own mind, or at least outwardly seemed not to believe it. But that was it. And there was no getting around it. The appeals went to nothing. And he tried all sorts of ways of trying to fight on appeals and various motions, but he was basically done at that point. The evidence was just too strong. And you had Messino testifying about him, and you had Cicali, your right-hand man, the guy who was very close to you. And it just went, it was a pretty hard case to beat.
In terms of that case, that death penalty case, Basciano was already doing, I believe, life in prison. It struck me at the time, and I think a lot of other observers, including people that traditionally are very tough on defendants, it struck me as a little unusual that the government would choose to take that case to trial when it would probably not alter the outcome of Basciano's sentence, meaning if he was found guilty or if he was found not guilty, he would still be coming out of prison in a body bag. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. Why does the government do that? Put people on trial again when they're already going to be in prison forever?
Well, I think the government, basically, I think was being vindictive with Basciano. I think you're right. You pointed it out. You already have him to life on a case. You could probably just try for life on the second case without having to go for the death penalty. But I think they were going after him because of not because he killed Santoro, but I think because because of what was alleged about his so-called plot to go after the prosecutor and the judge. I think that was behind it. But Basciano, on the death penalty end of this case, because you remember, death penalty aspects of the case are always, it's basically a second trial where the government tries to prove that he's worthy of death. But Basciano had some cards in his, in his hand there on that. I think it was impossible to overlook in the jury's mind that Messino was doing life and had killed 6 people, took a role in killing 6 people, and actually he admitted 12 murders, Messino. Basciano was convicted of 2, and may have committed more and solicited maybe some others, but we never know, what the jury was thinking. But the equation doesn't add up. You got Messino taking a walk, basically, and not getting the death penalty, and Basciano, for less, and being put close to the dock for basically less homicidal acts. So it kind of, I don't think the equation was right for the government on this, and that's where I think the government hubris worked against it. I don't think they couldn't. I don't think they couldn't win the moral argument.
Right.
On Basciano towards death. I don't think they could.
No, and clearly the jury felt the same way. What became of Vincent Basciano's sons? I know they had some legal troubles, and they were involved in. There was some news coverage of them a few years back as well.
Well, that's interesting. Had they been doing things a few years later, it wouldn't have bothered them. They got jammed up on some federal marijuana cases, of all things, in the Southern District. At least a couple of the sons did. And they got convicted. But, they got actually relatively light sentences. I think maybe a year, if not more than 2. And they're all out. And they're all out doing, presumably legitimate things. And, had this happened now, they might not have gotten as much trouble because of where we are with marijuana and the laws. But back then, that was, I forget exactly when it was, but things hadn't changed yet. But I keep looking at them and I say, what are they doing that, you're not seeing sold retail all over the place?
Sure. Yeah, it's very true, especially here in New York these days. Finally, Tony, what do we know these days about the status of the Bonanno crime family and the status of the mafia in general?
Well, we talked about this, you and I, over many months and years. I think the mafia in general started off that way. It's weakened. Over the years, it's been weakened. But I think they're in a period of reconstitution where some of the families, Genovese and Gambino, are more secretive and being run by, committees and triumvirates of people, and no longer one big boss. Because you become a boss, you're going to be, you might as well have a bullseye on your back. So that's what I think's going on. I think some of the families are really marginalized, like the Colombo crime family and the Lucchese's. the Bonannos, which is the one we haven't talked about here, have been seriously weakened with prosecutions from not only Massino's case, but up to very recent days. And they, I think, are in this they're run by, some street bosses, and they're not like they used to be. In fact, none of this, for some of these families, is like it used to be. I'm not saying they're not making money, and some of them are. But I think a lot of the families, some of the families, the Colombos and the Lucchese's particularly, I think are not really kind of on life support.
Yeah, it certainly seems like the glory days, the heydays of the Italian organized crime, La Cosa Nostra, it seems like those days are certainly gone.
Yeah, I think, you're right. I think here in the United States, I think that what we're seeing in Italy, there's still a very potent force. And I think there's some of the Italians in Italy, the Androgeda, the Sicilians, are here. And, part of this reconstitution that's going on. Whether they're going to be like it was now, I don't think so. And plus, it doesn't matter anymore in the sense that there's so many other crime groups and so many other people doing their thing and making so much more money. Financial frauds, you name it. So look, this stuff is romantic to us when we look back on it. And the mob has this romantic streak to it. We all know they did terrible things, but it's part of the American folklore. And that's what the mob has become. It's part of our ingrained folklore. Look, where would you see in the old days people having podcasts?
Right.
Right. The old guys, the old informants, the old mobsters doing podcasts and writing books and stuff. Not that there's anything wrong with writing books, but you wouldn't see that. This is things have changed. It's like part of our history now. And that's what we got.
That's true. Are there any? Because I can't think of one, honestly. Are there any forthcoming mafia trials on the docket that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. We had there was a construction-related case with the Gambinos out in Brooklyn federal court. There is one, I correct myself, there is one involving the Colombo crime family with Andrew Russo and some other defendants.
Yes, that's right.
Southern District, where there's some obscure labor racketeering. But those claims, if you peel back the indictment, these aren't major scams. These aren't major cases. There aren't like 7, 10, 12 murders involved or anything like that. It's just a different kettle of soup.
Yeah, that's
we're
true.
not seeing like you used to see it. When we started covering this stuff years ago, you used to have the commission case. You had these big mob cases. You had murders. You had John Gotti's case. You had all sorts of stuff. It's not there anymore.
This is true. The book is Vinny Gorgeous. You can also check out King of the Godfathers and a number of other books that Tony has written related to this stuff. Tony, hopefully you'll come back. We'll chat about some of your other books in the future.
Yeah, I'm fine, Frank. I really appreciate it. I really enjoy being on. You're one of the few people in this genre who are familiar with the territory. And you know what you're doing.
Well, I appreciate that. That's because I know who to read, and that includes reporters like you. Thanks very much, Tony.
Thanks a lot, Frank. Take care.
Thank you. If you liked what you heard today and you want to help us out, you can subscribe to this podcast. Encourage a friend to do so as well. We'll be back next week with some interesting stories from the underworld. Until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.